What kind of reaction is the movie getting?
Thus far, a very good reaction, because even the most skeptic individuals had to admit that this is a balanced report on Darwin. It's presenting things honestly, professionally, and leaving it to the people to decide. It's not forcing ideas down their throats.
It's actually quite a balanced movie.
It is.
And your website is very simple, creation.com.
Yes.
And people can order it.
By all means, yes. And within a month's time, it's going to also be available as Blu-ray.
In Blu-ray. And it was shot in HD.
Yes.
Wow, it looks terrific. I want to, we've covered a lot of territory in the last 3 interviews you and I have done. So instead of going over old territory, I want to move into some new territory. It's become very popular here in the last few years for there to be high-profile presentations by and discussions with and a lot of FaceTime on television given to atheists. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about Dawkins, I'm thinking about Christopher Hitchens, and I'm thinking even about, it was a novel, it's fiction, but the Da Vinci Code. Mm-hmm. It's kind of common currency these days, and in fact it's kind of trendy to be, or to claim to be, atheistic. How do you, say I'm an atheist right now, and I'm sitting here and I'm arguing the case for unfaith, and I'm saying God doesn't exist. And I'm not looking for a battle here, but as a scientist, as a geologist, as someone who has dug into the history of the planet, what's your approach to the atheistic perspective?
Well, for a long time it has been trying to produce evidence for the contrary, for the opposite view. But I understood that this is almost counterproductive. When you debate an atheist, you not debate evidence, you debate paradigm, worldview. Of course, it's a very easy way to dismantle atheistic thinking by saying, okay, you say that there is no God, therefore the thoughts that you produced are not based on absolutes, but just chemical reactions, which are totally relative in terms of the byproduct, which is the thought. Therefore, that particular thought that there is no God is not absolute. Mm. So it doesn't stand scrutiny. Unless you accept absolutes, there's no real discussion about God. Then, of course, there's the other side, which is still on the logical side of the argument. Okay, if you claim that nothing organized itself into everything, I'm paraphrasing G.K. Chesterton here, tell me, where did nothing take the rules from in order to organize? Or as Professor Paul Davies once wrote, how could stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. But the first atom that came into existence had to follow some rules, which unless he wrote it, or it wrote it, where did they come from? Nothing produces no rules. And there's no natural product or process that can produce rules. They just follow rules.
But isn't the fallback, well, it's just a matter of time. You need to have millions, billions, hundreds of billions of years, and through some kind of random selection process, you know, the order will evolve out of disorder.
There's nothing random in the way the electrons spin around an atom, a nucleus, right? I mean, randomness is on the grand scale apparent in some cases, but you're talking about the very matrix of matter. Without a very stable rule, without the 4 known forces that control the universe, the weak and strong force which actually work inside the nucleus, electromagnetic force and gravity, you wouldn't have anything happening, including randomness. So the problem is not what the random processes do, it is the product on which selection basically acts. That is already very regular, very well put together. It follows a logic. And that's where you actually, the time dimension is irrelevant in this thing. Because it doesn't matter when it started, it had to start with rules. You see, energy turns into matter, and matter turns into energy. But what controls that is information, is the very rule that controls such a process. And that information cannot come from matter or energy. Matter stores information, but it doesn't produce it. It reproduces information, but it doesn't produce it. Information comes from an intelligence. That is a fact, and you can't avoid it. But going back to your question, when we are debating or having an argument or trying to convince atheists, the first thing we need to avoid is to have them switch onto a defensive mode. If they feel attacked, then they will just try to find weakness in your arguments and go for that, never hearing your real arguments. If you start on a different tone and approach, saying, okay, listen, I totally understand your point of view. I know it's based on a lot of logical connections, but how about a different approach? You right away say, okay, so what's that? And you present it. In my case, whenever I speak in academic environments, the reaction I get at the end is the following: I don't believe a word of what you said, but it made sense. So basically, as a sort of evangelist, I've done my work. Now they know, they have no excuse. But they will say, I still prefer to go by my own choice, which is a paradigm without God. But now you cannot say that a paradigm with God is illogical because you heard it. So that's what we actually have to do, rather than crush them with our evidence. So this is all about presupposition. Show them that their knowledge is based on some assumptions that they start with, just as much as ours are based on assumptions. You cannot build anything without assumptions. So it all boils down to which one you choose. If you choose an atheistic worldview, that's fine. I know of a Polish atheist, by the way, who once said, when he was cornered, you know what, God wanted me to be an atheist. So he washed his hands. But that's a cheap escape, I should think.
It seems to me that to be a dogmatic atheist, at least, and I say dogmatic as opposed to, say, a skeptical atheist or maybe an on-the-fence atheist, you got to know a few things. You got to know, first of all, what God would look like if he did exist. Mm-hmm. I think, secondly, you'd have to know that there's no evidence for him anywhere out there in the trackless universe. And thirdly, you'd have to know that the hundreds of millions of people who've claimed a personal relationship with him were all wrong. I mean, and it seems that at some point they kind of have to back off to a sort of agnosticism. But I'm not sure that the agnostic perspective is any more defensible than the atheistic.
No, not really. But you know, you pointed something very interesting. You have to accuse people of if they believe in God. Well, here's a classical case. Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. If you check the definition of delusion, which is a medical term, a psychiatric term, it is holding a view against evidence, unless it's an article of faith. If it is an article of faith, it cannot be considered a delusion. That's what the definition says. Yet Dawkins entitles his book the God Delusion. So in other words, he is accusing the vast majority of people on earth to being deluded. And since delusion is a frequent element in schizophrenia, he's saying that if you believe in God, you're schizophrenic. Now normally you should sue such a person, given the facts. I mean, here's an Oxford scholar. He knows what that definition means. You cannot use deluded if you believe in God, unless you distort totally the definition. But you see, anything goes with people like this. Why? Because they hold the media at the tip of their fingers. They build foundations, people finance them. Why is that? Personally, I believe because their hatred of God. Not the fact that they're convinced that there's no God. They hate God. So, I have been looking into some of these guys who are what I call the Holy Trinity of anti-Christianity. And they seem to all have had some trauma in their early religious life. Like Dan Brown was raised in the Episcopalian Church, and he turned his back on it because it just couldn't answer the proper answers about creation. You see? And it became what we see today. If you don't address these issues early enough, then of course you're defenseless. And atheists will just chew you up easily because they use arguments that seem to be undefeatable, but actually they are.
You've heard the old adage, a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. Is that true?
Well, I would start by remembering what Aristotle said. Wit is educated insolence.
Wit is educated insolence.
So sometimes, although I so much feel tempted to use wit, I need to be cautious. Experience could be an accumulation of arguments.
Right.
So therefore, you're just opposing one argument with many other arguments.
Right.
For a Christian, it should be graciousness and true love towards the person.
Right.
Really being able to understand that I used to be there.
Right.
And what changed me? Somebody's graciousness. It was God first, but maybe somebody who talked to me with patience and love. Yeah. And not patting me on the shoulder, come on, you're ignorant, I'll know much better than these things. No. Yes, I used to be there, but how about this, how about that? And things move. To me, there's absolutely no doubt that no scientific argument per se would bring a person to Christ.